Short rows are used to shape your knitting, and this shaping technique involves working literally shorter rows so that you can create a vertical section that has more rows than the rest of your work. And in that way you can make a sort of triangular wedge shape in your knitting. They're often used for adding shaping for the bust, for shaping a neckline, especially on a seamless top-down sweater. And they're also a common technique that's used when you're working a certain type of sock heel. I'm going to show you how to work the German short row technique, which is a really great way to work short rows, especially for beginners, in that you don't need any special notions or equipment. You don't need something like safety pins or scrap yarn. And compared to some other methods, especially the common wrap and turn method, there's no kind of hunting around for which loop am I picking up. Is this the stitch? It's very clear which stitches you need to do something special with, and then what you need to do with those. And you do need to do something special because when you work a short row, you're working across a row and then turning your work as though you were at the end of the row before you get to the end of the row. And then you'll work back across either to the end of that row, or you might work a turn on that side as well. And that means that if we think about it like steps, here I might have 4 rows, and then here I'll have 6 rows. And where you have that little step, you'll get a hole in most fabrics. Garter stitch, sometimes they blend in, but in most fabrics you'll get a little hole where you turned. So you need to do something special to kind of prepare that little gap, so that when you come to completing your short row section, you're done with that wedge shaping and you want to just knit straight, then you can resolve those gaps so that you don't get holes. And German short rows is therefore a technique for resolving those gaps. You're going to create a double stitch after you turn your work. I'll show you how to do that. If that sounds totally mystifying, don't worry. So you're going to create a double stitch, and then when it comes time to resolve your short rows, you'll knit or purl into that double stitch as though it's one stitch, and everything will kind of magically snug up together and you won't get any gaps. And the end result will look something like this. Because many patterns, especially for newer knitters, are written using the wrap and turn short row technique, at the end of this video I'll also explain what to do if you decide you want to work German short rows instead of wrap and turn short rows. It's generally easier for a designer to write a pattern using a specific short row technique, but it's always just a personal preference thing. If you like something better, like German short rows, you can always substitute your preferred method for what the pattern uses. This is just a swatch. I'm going to work till 4 stitches remain on this row, and then I'll turn. But unlike some other short row methods, I'm going to turn the work before I do anything to sort of prepare the stitch for closing the gaps. So I'm just going to turn as though I was at the end of a row. Now I've got my wrong side facing and the yarn is at the front. And I'm going to leave it there. And then before I continue, I'm going to slip my first stitch of my left needle to the right needle tip purlwise. So as if I was going to purl that stitch and then off the needle. Snug the yarn up and get a bit loose there. And then I'm going to take this yarn to the back, which will pull up the 2 legs of the stitch below the one on my needle, and that's what creates our double stitch. So I'm taking the yarn to the back, and then to purl the next row I need it at the front, so I'm going to bring it to the front between the needles. Now make sure that yarn's nice and snug so that no extra slack has gone into these stitches. Purl across till I'm ready to work my turn on this side of the work. And again, since this is a swatch, I'll just stop with 4 stitches remaining, and I'm going to turn the work without doing anything special before turning, and I'm going to create my double stitch on this side in almost the same way, but before I do, my yarn is currently at the back, so I need to bring it to the front in between the needles, and then I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise from the left needle to the right needle tip, and then I'll create my double stitch in the same way. So give the yarn a nice tug and then take it to the back sort of over the right needle. You can see the two legs are being pulled up here. And now to knit, my yarn is already in the right place. It's at the back of the work. So I can knit this row, knit across until I'm ready to turn again. Show you that again on both sides once more, and then I'll show you how to work across those double stitches and close your gaps. I'm ready to turn again on the right side. Don't do anything special before turning. Just turn the work. The yarn is already towards me, it's already at the front. Slip the first stitch on the left needle as if to purl. Bring the yarn to the back, over the needle, and then to the front in between the needles, ready to purl. On the wrong side, I'm ready to turn, so turn the work. And now it's really important to remember to bring the yarn between the needles. When you've got the knit side facing you, the yarn comes between the needles so that it's towards you, it's the front before you slip that stitch. Then slip the first stitch on the left needle to the right needle tip. Bring the yarn over the right needle, pulling it up until you can see those two legs of the stitch from the row below are kind of being pulled up over the needle, and then knit across. Once I've done a few more turns on each side, I'll come back and show you how to close the gaps by knitting across them. I've now knit a couple more turns on each side, and I'm ready to finish up my short row shaping and continue knitting straight. To do that, I'm going to knit across, just treating each double stitch as though it's one stitch. So I'll show you that. I'm currently kind of in the middle of the work because I just turned here. I've been making short rows that get shorter and shorter on each side. Depending on your pattern, you might be starting at the beginning of a row or beginning of the round at this point. That's fine, and you can see where your turns are quite easily. You can kind of see where you've got two stitches that look just kind of like they're crisscrossing a little bit. They're really close together, and that can be helpful if you're trying to keep track of how many you've done, or that your turns are the right number of stitches apart. I'm going to knit to my first double stitch, and I'll show you how to work the double stitch. When you get to the double stitch, you are literally going to knit it as though it's one stitch. And you'll see that it's got kind of two bits of yarn that sort of link together. Don't worry about that. You want to kind of take your needle and make sure you're going in. So from front to back, you're knitting this stitch, and make sure that you go not straight through like this, where you're splitting the needles kind of coming out between two legs. And you may need to bring the needle a bit sort of more parallel to your left needle than you usually do in order to come out so that you've got two legs on this side and two legs on this side. That's what you're aiming for. And then knit that stitch as you normally would and slip the whole thing off the left needle. Show you that again. Go into the stitch as if to knit. Don't stab it straight through. Make sure that you're getting two legs on this side and two legs on this side. And then the whole thing can come off the left needle at once. End of the row, I can turn. And I'll purl across until I get to the first double stitch that I made on the other side of this wedge. Here's my double stitch on the purl side. You can see it's got these two little legs. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to purl those together as though it's one stitch. So from back to front to purl, making sure I've got both legs draped over my right needle there, and then I can complete that as for a normal purl stitch. through the middle, through both legs, and then the whole thing comes off the left needle. You can see I've now resolved all of my double stitches. I've only got kind of regular stitches here on the needle, and you can see the kind of arch shape that I've created where it's taller in the middle. I've literally got more rows here than I do here at the edges. If your pattern is written for wrap and turn short rows, or you're already familiar with that method and want to try German short rows, you can substitute German short rows for wrap and turns really simply. The key thing to understand is that when you work a wrap and turn short row, you're going to knit or purl across until it's time to work your wrap, and then you turn. And the wrap stitch is the stitch immediately after the stitch you get to when you're done knitting or purling. So in this example, if I wanted to turn, I'm going to work a short row, so my pattern would tell me to knit across to here and then wrap and turn. And my wrap stitch would be directly above this stitch. So that's one stitch further than you're knitting to. And that's your wrap stitch. And then when you come along and resolve your stitches, you'll pick up that wrap and knit it together with the stitch. When we substitute German short rows for wrap and turn short rows, we want to make sure that our double stitches are in the same place as our wrapped stitches were. And that means that when I knit across here, I'm going to knit one more stitch than my pattern tells me to, and then I'm going to turn, and then that stitch will become my double stitch. And I'll show you that on the needles. So let's clear these buttons out of the way. If I'm working a wrap and turn pattern and my pattern told me to knit to this point and then wrap and turn, I would slip my stitch, slip my next stitch, wrap my yarn around it, slip it back, turn. And you can see the little piece of yarn here. It doesn't actually matter if you've never worked a wrap and turn short row, but I just want you to see that you're wrapping yarn around a stitch, and that stitch is one that you haven't worked on this row. So you're knitting a certain number of stitches, and then you're wrapping the next stitch, and then you turn the work. Just undo that. So that was this column of stitches. I'm going to put it back on my left needle. And now if I want to substitute a German short row, I'm going to knit that stitch. So one more stitch than my pattern says. Then I'm going to turn and create my double stitch. That way my double stitches will be in the same place as my wraps were. When I'm resolving my short rows, I'll be doing that by resolving the same stitches in the same column.